Welcome back to our series on Plato's Republic. In this episode, we will be discussing Book 8 and the four different deviations of character and constitution from the deviations from the just man and the just society, which is alluded to as aristocracy and the aristocratic man. But you can think of what that ultimately means is the well-ordered man, the well-ordered society, the one that's just, the one that is properly ruled, and therefore there's a type of kingship in a way, but it's a type of governance where the ruler actually is the ruler and the subjects actually are subjects, and there's no internal tension where the subjects are trying to be the rulers or the ruler lets go of his power and wants someone else to take it over, or he's trying to do something else. The idea is you have the perfection of order both in the state and in the soul. And then you have these deviations, these degradations of that. And Socrates articulates four different stages. And I don't think it's best to think of these as four like radically different kinds, but it's actually just versions of tyranny or different strengths of tyranny. So at the lightest strength is the timocratic man, or timocracy, which is a slight deviation. And then as it gets worse and worse, as the tyranny gets worse and worse, that is, tyrannical power gets greater and greater, you start to shift from timocracy into oligarchy into democracy. And I think what ultimately this this picture of degradation is it's a fractioning or a splitting of the perfect unified whole into the parts, where the parts war against the whole, and in some ways the parts, this is just sort of a metaphysical metaphor, but the parts take the place, or try to take the place of the whole, and what we'll see is this inverts freedom. It inverts what it means to be a subject. And so you at tyranny, what happens is those who are perfect slaves actually become the rulers. And so it's the worst situation that one can find oneself in, that is in a tyrannical state, because the one who's doing the ruling is himself the one who's most enslaved. And so the freedom is going to be at a minimum in such a state. And this happens in the case of the soul as well. Think about your life and what's running your life. What aspect of you is in charge? Is it your hunger? Is it your lust? Is it your determination or lack of determination? Is it your reason? Is it love? Is it the will? Is it pride or honor? Right? So think about, like, what is it that's sort of running your life? And if it turns out that is what is most enslaved, meaning that is what is most controlled by something other than you have the least control over, put it that way. And if that's what's running your life, meaning that's what's determining or dictating all of your choices, all of your thoughts, all of your emotions and reactions, then your life is going to be an enslaved life, because the ruler of it, namely that one part that is the tyrant of your soul, is itself enslaved. And so not only do you become enslaved, but you paradoxically become enslaved by one who is himself enslaved. And so it's sort of the worst situation of all. And you ultimately get to that state by a deviation from the replacement of the whole by the parts, where the parts try to overtake the whole. And one step away from that tyrannical state is the democratic state. We're kind of working in reverse. And the democratic state is the one where the many are the ones that are ruling, right? And so who's making the decisions? Well, it's going to be the majority, the many. And so there's still a sense of it not being as bad as tyranny, but the type of freedom that Plato thinks is present in a democratic state or via democracy is only going to be a pseudo freedom, and we can talk about this here in a bit. But it's a freedom which comes through the privatization of the part, such that nothing interferes or gets in the way of the life of the part. And the reason this is only a pseudo freedom for Plato is because education, going back to what we saw in books 6 and 7, education isn't going to really play a role, because the only type of education that could occur would be a type of forced education. The idea in a democracy is sharing is not something that would occur unless one makes the decision to want to be educated, right? So the way that the just society was that they share everything in common, everything gets properly ordered, going back to the need for musical education, which is about harmonizing of the parts into a whole. But once the parts are cut off from each other, which Plato thinks happens within a democratic state, where the parts become their own, they have their own life, they have their own will, they have their own goals, their own purposes that don't intermingle or they're not interconnected. That separation makes it impossible for there to be an internal unity between the parts. Rather, the best that can happen is some form of external agreement or social contract, which was alluded to in Book 2 with Glaucon's description of what the many think justice is. And so the only hope for freedom within the democratic state is as an external freedom, because it's going to have to be a freedom that circumnavigates education, which is, as we saw in the allegory of the cave, it's internal freedom. There's a type of internal unity that is had in education. Remember, the whole body is turned towards the light, turned towards the exit of the cave. And so unless the whole body, all the parts are ordered properly, one won't be able to understand. Going back to that image or that analogy of the cave, think about if you have an aspect of your life which is overly like domineering, overly controlling, such that you have just a difficult time staying focused because you're just so addicted to thinking about sports or thinking about something else, it's going to be difficult to take the time and have the patience and the perseverance to read through Plato's Republic. You're going to constantly be finding your attention pulled elsewhere. And that's to say that this other aspect of your life is keeping you from being able to turn towards higher things, and so you're being enchained to the world of sports, unable to, even though your intellect, you sort of want to ascend or transcend or to see the world as fully good in the image and likeness of God, as we were referring to last time, to see everything as participating in the good. You might want to have that view on reality, but because you have this enslavement to the world of sports or the world of the passions, whatever it might be, that's going to prevent you from actually doing that. So the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and it's what enslaves you. And so the whole of you, best way to put it, needs to be turned in the same direction. And the problem for Plato in a democratic society is that there's no grounds for unifying all the parts or all the various members, citizens, parts or faculties, if we're talking about the soul, in the same direction, because each has its own say, each has its ability to speak as loudly as any other. Each has the ability to correct the other one. There's no proper authority in a democratic society. Each has the same weight, and so whatever turns out to be the strongest in regards to number, or the strongest in amount to like gravity or weight, that's going to then overpower the others. So this is ultimately a pseudo freedom, Plato thinks, because it will inevitably lend itself to tyranny. It'll lend itself to a type of enslavement. And now, if you think about your own life, the instances of your own life where you have not given any attention or any thought or any wherewithal to how your life is going or whether you should X, Y, or Z, you might not have ever asked the question, I know this is a lot of fun, but maybe I'm forming a bad habit here. You've never given that much thought until several years down the line, when it's too late and you realize, wait a second, I'm not free anymore. I can't make decisions about how my life goes because I'm so addicted or enslaved or bound to this thing that I had not originally thought would be enslaving. I thought this was something that I had the strength and the power and the freedom to choose, but now I come to realize that what this has done is it's actually enslaved me. And so then the question is how do you find freedom from that? That's the great challenge. And Plato doesn't really address that too much, but what he does address is the need to avoid that error. And that error is one that begins so subtly, like it's such a subtle source or origin. Here's how Socrates thinks this occurs. This at the very beginning of Book 8, where he begins to talk about democracy, which is it's the type of constitution where the rulers are those that are the ones that love honor, as he calls them, the honor-loving constitution. And I think the thing to realize about what's happening here is you have the honorable life, the honorable action, and then you have the effect of that, which is the honor that's received. You could think of it like, instead of honor, think of it in a context more akin to our situation now. You do an action of charity, and you're more interested in the praise that you are given because of that action. Now, it is a praiseworthy action. You do something like you donate a kidney or something. That's a praiseworthy action. People should recognize that if you give a kidney to someone, you're very likely such that you have a really great character. It's not easy to give away kidneys. So you have done something praiseworthy. But the timocrat, or within the timocracy, what's the real goal isn't doing the action which happens to be praiseworthy, but you're more interested in the praise received for doing the action. And so that becomes your ultimate goal. And that's automatically a division. You're automatically starting to separate the reality, the good of the action, from its effect, right? So I think what Socrates is trying to articulate is a separation of reality from appearance, or the internal from the external, and is going to incline or entice one to this division, or this choice between which do you really care about? Do you care about the internal, or do you care about the external? And once that division has been made, it's going to be sort of overly tempting, it seems, for a preference to be given to the external, and then you're automatically now slowly turned away from the good as such, and you're now ordering your life towards the effects of the good, and it's a subtle distinction. It doesn't seem that significant, but I think where this ultimately goes is what we just said a little bit ago, which is ultimately to tyranny. It's a loss of freedom. It's a loss of control over oneself. It's that the internal order is now replaced by an external order. And ultimately what an external order is, thinking about it in terms of like an order coming from the outside, it's a type of tyranny. Think about a law. If you're talking about law, an external law is one where someone from the outside is telling you, do this and don't do that. There's nothing wrong with external laws in principle, provided that they correspond to some internal reality. If there's no internal reality or internal reason for why the law is like intrinsically good or intrinsically such that it makes things good, then it's just sort of brutal force, right? If you have a law that says people have to wear blue on Tuesday, there's nothing intrinsically or internally good about that law, meaning there's nothing that corresponds to the betterment of the human being that would lead one to make that pronouncement, that legislative pronouncement. And so the law itself would be like a tyrannizing law. It would be a making someone do something for no internal reason. So the external isn't bad, provided it's always rooted in something internal. And this is why the sort of in a theological context, you could think about the Ten Commandments find their fulfillment in the Beatitudes, which would be like an internal grounding for the external law. And so I think the relationship between the Old and the New Covenants seems to be this grounding or this rooting of the external in the internal. I don't want to go into that too much, but I think there's something significant there, which is why you don't get a destruction of the law, but a fulfillment of it, right? And I think that corresponds with what we have been talking about here. Okay, so all deviation, political or psychological, meaning like pertaining to the soul, deviation is a type of faction within the whole. And so here's how Socrates puts this. This is on 545d. Here's what Socrates says. Come on then, let's try to describe how democracy emerges from aristocracy. So how does the first deviation occur? And here's what he says. Or is it simply the case that in all constitutions, change originates in the ruling element itself when faction breaks out within it, but that if this group remains of one mind, then, however small it is, change is impossible? And Glaucon says, yes, that's right. So the idea is deviation or change or corruption occurs when the ruling element, that is that which properly unites or properly rules everything, splits. There's a type of two ends in this individual, and so the life of that individual can start to come apart. The life of that society can start to come apart. You start to serve two masters. The life of education and the life of the pleasures, and if it's such that these are not connected or related or ordered into like a harmonious whole, such that the pleasures properly find their meaning in relation to education, but rather these are just treated as related, separate pursuits, then that life or that society is going to find itself coming apart. You start to pursue two different reasons or goals, or the logos is now going to be twofold, and so there's not going to be a single good at which you're striving, and so it's going to like war against itself inevitably in some form. Think about the organism. Going back to the notion of the organism, this is something like an autoimmune disorder where the individual organism starts to sort of metaphorically see itself as trying to do two different things. In one way, it's trying to digest glutens, but there's another part of that individual. So this is why this is a type of disorder. That other part of that individual is trying to say, no, don't digest this type of gluten or whatever. And so what you get is one and the same organism is telling two different things. It would be good to do this, and another part saying, no, it would not be good to do this. And so there's a fight or a battle between these two parts, which will ultimately mean that there's an internal corruption or internal disorder, and we describe that biologically as it's unhealthy, right? That plays itself out psychologically and also socially. Different parts proffer different ends or goals, which is ultimately what leads to a civil war within the state or within the soul, and it's what we would then say is unhealthy. It's politically unhealthy. It's psychologically unhealthy, and this happens slowly within these different forms of constitution. And I don't want to get into the details, although the details I think are interesting. Some of the points of reflection on the notion of money and private property, I think is really, significant and important. There's one way of reading this which kind of aligns with some things in some of the works of Marx, and so there have been some Marxists that have interpreted various aspects of this. Because it seems that what's going on is the problem of disorder is that there's this external condition of these two different classes. He talks about these two different classes on, let's see, this is 551D. The city that's split, he says, that a city of this sort is not one, but inevitably two, a city of the poor and one of the rich, living in the same place and always plotting against one another. So if you have a city that has two different classes, both aimed at two different ultimate goals, then there's always going to be a war between the two, or at least tension between the two. And so it's not until those two classes, those two groups can come into unity with one another so as to have a single goal, you won't actually have a state or a city, but you'll have two sort of sub-cities, and only a simulacra of a whole. You won't actually have an overarching government. It'll be these two smaller states battling with each other to see who's going to come out on top. And so the goal of communism, interestingly, even though I think it's ultimately sort of wrong-headed for reasons I can talk about here in a bit, but the goal of communism is sort of a legitimate goal. It's wanting to unify this faction that it sees occurring within society, and it sees that the root of this faction is that there is inequality. And now the thing about how it tries to resolve that that faction, I think is problematic. I mean, it's a complicated story, but it seems that it tries to resolve the separation or the faction by an external or an extrinsic solution, and therefore the unity that's going to be brought about will at best be an external or an extrinsic unity. You can think of it this way: if it turns out that people don't have, there's inequality, and it's this inequality that you take to be the root of jealousy, and you say, okay, well, let's just have let's have commonality across the board. Let's level the playing field, give everyone an equal footing. That would be an external form of equality, which wouldn't overcome or constitute a solution for any of the internal inequalities that there may or may not be in the individuals. And so even by the institution of an external equality, you would still find an internal inequality. And this, I think, is what is at the root of Henri de Lubac's reflections on Marx and Marxism in his book, The Drama of Atheist Humanism. Wonderful book, but the problem is that the external conditions are manifestations or revelations of internal conditions, such that the external is an image of the internal. And so thinking that you would fix the internal by tinkering with the external is only sort of like a foolish pipe dream. Now, granted, it's a good observation that there's something wrong with the division that you see, this division, but it's completely ignorant of the fact that the external division is rooted in this internal division. And this is what Socrates actually articulates at the beginning when he says, we're going to talk about 4 different forms of constitutions or governments, ways of ruling a state. And he says, but there have to be just as many ways of ruling the soul, because there's a 1-to-1 correlation between the constitution and the character of an individual. Here's what he let's see, I believe this is right at the beginning, 544d. Here's what Socrates says. Are you aware then that there must be as many forms of human character as there are of constitutions? Or do you think constitutions arise from oak or rock, and not from the characters of the people in the cities, which tip the scales, so to speak, and drag the rest along with them? So it looks like Socrates is suggesting that the constitutions are externalizations of the characters, not like characters in terms of like characters of a play, but the character types of those that live. So if you have a bunch of oligarchic souls, the form of government they're going to instill or institute, or the maybe the better way of putting it, a bunch of oligarchic people are going to constitute an oligarchy. A bunch of democratic people, meaning people that have democratic souls, are going to constitute a democracy. A bunch of people with tyrannical souls are going to constitute a tyranny, right? And so it's not just a fluke that you have the correlation between the souls and the forms of constitution, but rather there's a causal relation. The character is what gives rise to the external image known as the state, right? So this is why, going back to what we saw much earlier on in the Republic, the state is the soul written large, as he puts it early on, right? So the state or society is an image of the the character that lives within it. So if you want to know the type of character that someone has, one way to look or think about this is to look at what form of government do they live under. Now, I think it's not a direct one-to-one type of correlation, but you might say on a whole, that's the case. There can be outliers. Like Socrates is an outlier, I think, for the Athenian people and the Athenian form of government. But I think that the point being is this is the root of degradation or perversion of justice. It's a splitting or a separating of the internal from the external, the intrinsic from the extrinsic, the reality from the appearance. And once you split those and isolate them, you now are going to be treating appearance as if it were its own reality. And you'll be treating reality as if it weren't something that I encounter in appearance. This happens in relation to creation and God. If you think about if God is stripped or externalized entirely from creation, then you won't think of creation as in any way communicating God or God being present in creation, nor will you think, right? So you won't think of creation as having any significance to it. But you'll also God will be so out of reach that, like, what can I know about God? What's the meaning of God? God becomes almost irrelevant to me because he's so out of grasp. And so it's whether I think about him or not doesn't really matter. And so I think this separation or this externalization of creation from God is it's very damning. It really does strip creation of its logos, of its real meaning, and it actually, by placing God at such a high pedestal, it makes him, as if he doesn't matter, because he doesn't have any effect or any connection, internal connection with the incarnate. And so there's almost a uselessness, a pointlessness to the existence of God. Maybe you are concerned with debating whether God exists, but it doesn't really mean anything to you if God's thought about as extrinsically separated from creation. And so this is why I think the notion of beauty, which is a key notion in Plato, it's also a key notion in the work of Hans Urs von Balthasar, but the notion of beauty in Plato is one where the forms make an appearance in physical form, right? So the forms become revealed, and so you encounter the forms through or in the matter, rather than just seeing the matter as entirely unrelated. And so the beauty is an attempt to try to unify or wed the internal and the external, trying to say there's a difference, but there's no separation between the internal and the external. But once you do get a separation between the two, then you're on a fast road to tyranny. Okay, so that's what Book 8 ultimately is about. And next time we'll be turning to Book 9, which begins with a more articulate discussion of the tyrant himself. And so that's what we will be returning to next time.